Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Melcher, and I'm Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts. We're delighted to welcome people from across the country, some old friends as well as new folks, to hear from Kurdistan Regional Government Representative to the U.S., Bayan Rahman. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. Many thanks to our sponsor for today's program, Bacon & Wilson Attorneys at Law. And we are also grateful to board member Jeremy Cole of JD Cole TV, who will make a video of this program available on our website and on our YouTube channel. We are pleased to continue to partner with Valley Eye Radio, which will broadcast the audio of today's talk for their listeners with visual impairment. Our next virtual event will be on Thursday, December 9th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we will welcome the U.S. Department of State Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs Deputy Director of Venezuelan Affairs, Marlena R. Casey, who will provide insight into the ongoing situation in Venezuela and U.S. foreign policy in the region. You can find more information or register for that program at our website, wacwestma.org, wacwestma.org. Our speaker today is Kurdistan Regional Government Representative to the U.S., Bayan Rahman. Key to her role are strengthening ties between Kurdistan and the United States and advocating her government's position on a wide array of political, security, humanitarian, economic, and cultural matters, and promoting coordination and partnership. Prior to her U.S. appointment in 2015, she was the High Representative to the United Kingdom. She was elected to the Leadership Council of the Kurdistan Democratic Party in 2010. Before her career in public service, she worked as a journalist for 17 years. She began her career with local newspapers in London and then went on to work at the Observer and later at the Financial Times, where she worked in Britain, and in Japan, where she was the Tokyo correspondent. She has something of a special relationship with us here in Western Massachusetts, in that she is great friends with longtime council member and frequent speaker, Ambassador Mark Hambley, who speaks very highly of her and her family. Also in 2018, our delegation to the World Affairs Councils of America National Conference was pleased and proud to host her at our table during the Ambassadors Luncheon. Today she will be speaking to us about the U.S. and Kurdistan region, Iraq, a growing partnership. So please join me in welcoming Representative Bayan Rahman.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome, Cynthia. It's a real pleasure to be with you and your members. And I do remember you and others at that lunch, and then also at our representation when we had a reception. I've always enjoyed interacting with the World Affairs Council chapters across the United States, and it's a great pleasure to be doing this. I hope next time it will be in person. Zoom is great, and we're all very grateful for technology helping us out during this pandemic. But in my opinion, nothing beats person-to-person contact and discussion and I guess just getting to know each other. So thank you again for inviting me. So if it's okay, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I would like to share with you. And Cynthia, I think you said you're going to help me with that.
Yes, in 1 second.
Thank you. So if we go to the next couple of slides, the next one is just my name, just to let you know who I am, but Cynthia's already introduced me very kindly. So before I really talk about Kurdistan today, our relationship with the United States, I feel that I really need to give some geographical and some historic and cultural background. So we will start with a few maps. So if we go to the next slide. So this slide is not necessarily 100% accurate, but it's not bad at showing parts of the Middle East where there are Kurdish populations. So as you can see, Kurdistan is actually quite large. It crosses the boundaries of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. If all of Kurdistan was one independent country, it would be about the size of France. And our population size, depending on who you believe, would be anything from 25 million to 45 million. So if Kurdistan were an independent, unified country, it would be a very big geographic and population-wise, a very big player in the Middle East. You can also see on this map that there are Kurds further afield, for example, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, in eastern side of Iran, actually, and then in areas that were part of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin had a policy of dispersing minorities across the Soviet Union so that they would never have a significant enough population in one area. But by and large, the Kurds are divided between Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. And as I said, the population is fairly significant. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to show you is Kurdistan region in Iraq. So today in my presentation, I will really be focusing only on Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, Kurdistan region in Iraq is more or less 4 governorates, 4 provinces. On this map, it shows 3. That's because Soleimani province now has become 2 provinces, the province of Soleimani and Halabja. So actually Kurdistan in Iraq is made up of 4 provinces. But if we go to the next slide, we will see that actually Iraqi Kurdistan is bigger than just those 4 provinces. So on this map, the green area is the area that is governed by the Kurdistan Regional Government, which I represent in Washington. So the KRG, or Kurdistan Regional Government, governs that area. But the areas that you see shaded in yellow, and I think, yes, the pink area as well, we would call this disputed territories, or this is how they're described in the Iraqi constitution. From our perspective, they are geographically, historically, culturally Kurdish areas. And even today, the majority people there are Kurds, but through various acts of genocide, gerrymandering, forced displacement, the Kurds were forced out of those areas, and in the current Iraqi constitution, they're described as disputed territories, and there's a mechanism for settling that dispute, but that mechanism has never been dealt with. So this is the geographic part done with, and then I want to just move on to the cultural and ethnic makeup of the people of Kurdistan. So this picture shows the Lalish main Yezidi holy site for the Yezidi people. This is their most sacred site in the world. Now, the Yazidis are an ancient faith group that have been in that part of the world for thousands of years. Some people believe that their origins were Zoroastrian. Many believe that the Kurds, all of the Kurds, were Zoroastrian. But anyway, nowadays, the majority of Kurds are Muslim. But the Yazidis are in Sinjar, which is actually where I'm from, even though I'm not Yazidi. And they are, unfortunately, a very persecuted ethno-religious group. But the Yazidis are part of our society. And then if you move on to the next slide, you will see that we also have a substantial, but still a minority who are Christian. Now, the Christians in Iraq used to be much, much larger in number. Over the years, the numbers have dwindled, partly through persecution, but really partly just because Iraq was a dictatorship for so long. Everybody suffered under that dictatorship. So more and more of the Iraqi population left over time. There are estimates that in 2000, let's say 2 or 3, there were about 1.5 million in Iraq. Today, perhaps less than 200,000. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. But just to, again, reiterate that Kurdistan region in Iraq, yes, the majority are ethnically Kurds and by religion Sunni Muslim, but there are many, many other cultures, faiths, and ethnicities in the Kurdistan region. And by and large, we live in great harmony with each other. Of course, that doesn't mean there isn't any racism or prejudice. Unfortunately, there is. But our laws, our culture is very much one of openness and open door and peaceful coexistence. And, you know, for us, the Christians who are Assyrian by ethnicity, they are the indigenous people of Iraq and Kurdistan. And you could say the same of the Yezidis. They have been there for thousands of years. So now I want to move on to some history, and then that will bring us onto our relationship with the United States and where we are today. So unfortunately, you can't really talk about the Kurds without talking about genocide, without talking about persecution. Wherever we are, whether it's in Iran, Turkey, Syria, or Iraq, the Kurds have been denied. We have been denied our culture, our existence. In Turkey, until not long ago, Kurds were referred to as mountain Turks, that there was no such thing as a Kurd. So we have been denied our culture, our language, our history, our heroes. Many of our heroes in our history have been claimed by the Persians or the Arabs or the Turks. And it's only now that we are able to tell our own story that we can claim some of those heroes back and or share them. We don't mind sharing them, but at least don't deny that they have a Kurdish heritage. So just focusing on Iraqi Kurdistan. Unfortunately, from really the 1950s onwards, we have suffered an Arabization program. Arabization is what Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party named their program of forcefully displacing Kurds out of what later became known as the disputed territories, forcing the Kurds out and paying Arab families from southern Iraq to come and live in their homes, take their farms, take their businesses, and so on. And this is how those disputed territories became disputed. They were not disputed until this forced migration and displacement took place. And Arabization was brutal. Some people were displaced, and that's catastrophic in itself. Others simply disappeared by their tens of thousands. Then many of you will have heard about Halabja, which is a very beautiful city in Iraqi Kurdistan, bordering the mountains that then cross over to Iran. It's really very magnificent and beautiful. Unfortunately, in 1988, Saddam used chemical weapons on the people of Halabja, killing 5,000 men, women, and children, civilians, in that chemical weapons attack. So this is the single largest number of casualties in civilian casualties in a chemical weapons attack. So, and then there was the Anfal genocide campaign, which was an 8-stage, very carefully planned and publicized genocide campaign. By publicized, I mean Saddam Hussein named it Anfal after a verse in the Quran, and carried out this operation where nearly 200,000 people were killed or disappeared. So this was our history in Iraq. Rather than the Kurds and Arabs being seen as partners and brothers in one country, our share of being partners in Iraq was this. It was genocide, it was denial, it was cultural oppression, and very, very brutal scorched earth policy. In the mid-70s till around, let's say, 1991, Saddam Hussein's party, which was in power, destroyed 4,500 villages in Kurdistan. So only 500 villages were left standing. And by destroyed, I mean they were turned into rubble. And farmers were shot on sight if they were seen farming on their lands. And the reason for this was we were a very rural agricultural society, and Saddam Hussein wanted to break the backbone of our economy and our culture. So he destroyed the villages, the village way of life, the rural way of life. And to this day, we feel the impact of that policy. So for us, life under Saddam Hussein was no life at all. People were being wiped out, were being disappeared. There was genocide, there was oppression, and it seemed to us that nobody really cared. And then in 1990, Saddam made a very big mistake. He invaded Kuwait, and the United States, Britain, other countries formed this international coalition that liberated Kuwait. And during that time, President George H.W. Bush encouraged the people of Iraq to rise up against Saddam Hussein. Well, we Kurds, we didn't really need much encouragement. So in early 1991, there was an uprising. There was an uprising in southern Iraq by the Shia Arabs, and also in Kurdistan against Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. Unfortunately, Saddam was able to push back on the uprising using helicopter gunships. So this was in early 1991. The chemical bombardment and genocide that I spoke about had happened only a couple of years or 3 years earlier. Everybody thought that Saddam Hussein would use his chemical weapons again. As a result, in early 1991, in the spring, nearly 2 million, I mean, at least 1 million, but many people think it was closer to 2 million Kurds fled Kurdistan and Iraq to the mountains that bordered Turkey and Iran for safety, because we all believed that Saddam Hussein would use his chemical weapons again. And then if we go to the next slide, we will see that very quickly, the United States, the UK, France, and a few other countries launched an operation called Operation Provide Comfort. This was in the spring of 1991, in April. So April 2021 will be the 30th anniversary of that operation. Operation Provide Comfort was a game changer for our future and for, of course, that moment of time when we were going through this catastrophic event. As I said, at least 1 million, perhaps 2 million Kurds had fled to the mountains in the spring of 1991. It was still extremely cold. People died of exposure. Some of my own relatives died, elderly relatives died in that exodus. And then Operation Provide Comfort was launched. And those of you who are interested, James Baker flew in a helicopter to Turkey, to the mountainside to see for himself. And I met him actually, I think at your event. And I managed to speak to him for a few moments, and he remembered that moment when he was on the mountainside, and he said he immediately called President Bush and said that we have to do something about this. And this is how Operation Provide Comfort began. Operation Provide Comfort was the largest military and humanitarian operation of its kind at that time in history. Even today, I don't know if there's been anything as big, perhaps there has, but certainly at that time, this was something new. And it saved thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of lives. And this really began our friendship and our partnership with the United States. We will never forget Operation Provide Comfort. We will never forget that millions of people were saved in that operation. And I've had the honor of meeting many of the military leaders in the United States who were involved in that operation. For example, General Tony Zinni, Jay Garner, Jim Jones, and each one of them remembers it very clearly, and they all see it as a very important moment in their own lives and in their own careers. So Operation Provide Comfort really is, I would say, a very important moment in the relationship between Kurdistan, the United States. It saved countless lives, and it changed the trajectory for the people of Kurdistan. Up to that point, we had been under a brutal dictatorship. We had seen nothing but genocide and destruction. Suddenly, we were under the protection of the international community. So after Operation Provide Comfort, a no-fly zone was established, and this no-fly zone continued all the way to 2003 and provided some form of, not complete, but a very powerful protection for the people of Kurdistan. Then also in the 1990s, the United Nations began the Oil for Food program. So this was a program whereby Iraq's oil was sold, but the money was used to provide food and medicine and humanitarian assistance to the people of Iraq. Now, in Kurdistan region, the combination of being protected by the no-fly zone and having some money come to Kurdistan from the UN Oil for Food program, this was another thing that made a very big difference to our fortunes. Suddenly, we were able to begin to rebuild some of the destroyed villages that I mentioned earlier. We were able to, for example, bring our dream of democracy to fruition. In 1992, so just 1 year after Operation Provide Comfort, we held the first ever free and fair elections in the Kurdistan region. After those elections, we created the Kurdistan Parliament, the Kurdistan Regional Government. We passed a law that recognized the Peshmerga forces as the legitimate army and the legitimate armed forces of the Kurdistan region. So really, none of this would have been possible if there hadn't been that intervention in 1991, and then the protection that was afforded us throughout the 1990s. Then another important moment is 2003. So if we go to the next slide, in 2003, of course, the the United States and many coalition partners, the UK and many other countries, liberated Iraq. Now, I use the word liberated because, as I described earlier, if you were Kurdish and you lived in Iraq, your life was a hell. It was genocide, it was destruction, the use of weapons of mass destruction on your people. And we were concerned that, yes, of course, we had that protection throughout the 1990s, but we know that our international friends get tired, and sometimes their attention span is not as long as we would like. So we were always concerned that at some point that protection would come to an end. It would be seen as too costly and so on, and perhaps it would come to an end. And Saddam never gave up on completely ridding himself of that international sanctions and so on, and coming back full force, developing nuclear weapons and anything else that he had plans to do. So for us, absolutely, 2003, the American intervention was a liberation. So this intervention in Iraq changed many things for us. It liberated us from where we were before. It meant that Kurdistan could open up to the international community. We opened 2 international airports. We have private schools, public schools. Today, there are 2 schools that are called 2 universities, 2 American universities, but many, many others. I think altogether about 30 or more universities in Kurdistan. In 1991, we only had 1 university. Everybody wants to learn English. If not English, then it's French or German. We have really been able to build and rebuild Kurdistan. We have been able to promote Kurdistan as a tourism destination. And we see tourism and agriculture as potential areas of economic development. I can come back to the economy a little bit later. But we also critically started an oil and gas industry. So we always knew that Kurdistan must be rich in oil and gas, like much of the Middle East and the rest of Iraq. But it was never developed because successive Iraqi governments didn't want the Kurdistan region's oil to be produced because they saw it as a way for the Kurds to have some economic independence and then head towards full independence. So all of that oil that was under the ground was completely neglected in the Kurdistan region. After the liberation and the drawing up of a new constitution in Iraq, and that constitution was overwhelmingly approved of in a referendum by all of the population of Iraq. That constitution gives the Kurdistan region certain rights on the development of oil fields in the Kurdistan region. So we began an oil and gas industry from scratch, really in 2007, maybe 1 or 2 years before, but really began in 2007 when we passed an oil law in the Kurdistan region. So I call this period a golden decade. If you keep in mind what I said about our history, about the destruction of livelihoods, of death, scorched earth policies, and so on, suddenly Kurdistan is flourishing. We have media, we have the ability to travel, the ability to welcome people to Kurdistan, and we can build and construct. And so this was this beautiful golden decade. And then unfortunately, if we go to the next slide, 2014, we have ISIS and the beginning of their genocide against some Kurds, but really mainly the Yezidi and Christian populations who were targeted, but Kurds, Arabs, others as well. So I just want to give a little bit of background on ISIS and how they came about and why they targeted the Yazidis, the Christians, the Kurds, and why they tried to attack Kurdistan region. So in that golden decade that I spoke about, where Kurdistan was flourishing, we also had at the beginning a period of real optimism in Kurdistan. We believed that this new Iraq that was liberated by the United States and others would be very different from the Iraq of old. It would be the end of dictatorship, the end of not recognizing or respecting the other. And we really invested as much as we could in this new Iraq that we believed would be democratic, federal, and pluralistic, that we would all be equals no matter our faith or our ethnic backgrounds. So all of that was really captured, or much of that was captured in the Iraqi constitution of 2005. We began with this great optimism about our future inside Iraq and this new Iraq that we thought we were now going to live in. But over time, during that golden decade, unfortunately, as Kurdistan was flourishing economically and socially, our relationship with the federal government in Baghdad was deteriorating. And this really got even worse, I would say, after 2010, when the political leaders in Baghdad really started to implement very sectarian policies. And then with the withdrawal of American troops and American forces in 2011, they were really emboldened. And so the relationship between Erbil, which is our capital, and Baghdad, the federal capital, deteriorated more and more. Another relationship that had never really got off the ground and became even worse after 2010-11 is the relationship between the Sunni Arab community and the Shia Arab community. Of course, there had already been an insurgency by the Sunni Arabs who had lost power through the intervention by the United States. But I have to say, the federal government in Baghdad, a Shia-led government, and I don't really want to make differences by faith and religion, but it's a fact that the Shia are the ruling or the stronger partners in the coalition government in Baghdad. They implemented, especially after 2011, very, very aggressive policies that were against the Sunni Arab community. They hounded some of their legitimate leaders out of the country. When some of the Sunni Arab communities held protests, protesting a lack of services, lack of clean water or something like that, instead of the government listening to them, they were barrel bombed. So this is how they were treated. So the Sunni Arab community was increasingly angry, and we in Kurdistan were increasingly marginalized. So over time, Al-Qaeda in Iraq had morphed into Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. And ISIS really started to get a lot of support inside Iraq. Some of it was because there was a feeling that they had lost power. The Sunni Arab community, even though it was a minority, had been in control of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Others were very angry at the way they had been treated by Baghdad. And really, ISIS was a kind of a marriage between the Baathists, the leftovers of Saddam Hussein's party, and this kind of Islamist, radical terrorist grouping that had come out of Al-Qaeda. So ISIS was and remains absolutely brutal. I'm sure you've all seen the terrible things that they did and would still do today if they could. So in 2014, ISIS overran Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. The Iraqi military who were in Mosul left all of their weapons and fled, and ISIS, of course, suddenly had its hands on the best American weaponry that had been left behind by the Iraqi army. And they used those weapons to attack the Christian community, the Yezidi community, Arabs, Turkmen, Kurds, others. And so this is what happened in 2014. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to talk about what happened to Kurdistan in 2014. So we've just had this wonderful golden decade, and then suddenly 2014 happens. So first we have a financial crisis. Even before ISIS overran Mosul, which was in June 2014, and then began its genocide that summer and tried to take our capital, the regional capital of Erbil. All of that was over the summer of 2014. Even before then, Baghdad began to withhold our share of the federal budget. They just cut it down to zero. So we went from having about $1 billion a month as our share of the federal budget to having zero. This was coupled soon after with a crash in oil prices, and Kurdistan, like the rest of Iraq, is unfortunately overly reliant on oil for most of our revenues. Then we were flooded with refugees and IDPs, or internally displaced persons. So don't forget, we're right next to Syria, and the conflict in Syria since 2011 has been going on. And we were flooded with refugees from Syria. And then suddenly, by the hundreds of thousands, people were fleeing other parts of Iraq, fleeing ISIS to come to Kurdistan region. Even today, we have 1 million fellow Iraqis who are still displaced in the Kurdistan region, and nearly 250,000 Syrian refugees. And then to continue what the challenges that we were facing in 2014 onwards, we had suddenly overnight a 650-mile front line to protect against this very well-armed, very well-financed terrorist organization that had a caliphate, or so-called caliphate. And many of our Peshmerga forces were wounded and killed in the fight against ISIS. So this is the challenge that we faced in that difficult period in 2014. So if you remember, in 2011, the United States had withdrawn from Iraq. So in 2014, when ISIS struck, of course, we were calling our friends in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Rome, and pleading with them to help us, to help Iraq, to help Kurdistan against this terrorist organization. And as I said earlier, they had just captured American weapons and were using them against us. And the Peshmerga forces, our forces, were very under-equipped. And I can explain that later, perhaps in the Q&A, if you want, why that was. But we didn't have the weapons to fight against the kind of weapons that ISIS had. So we were calling all of our friends. And in August 2014, ISIS was attacking the Yazidis, and they were fleeing to Mount Sinjar to take shelter there. And it was on, I believe, August the 7th, 2014, that President Obama ordered airstrikes against ISIS. And the airstrikes began against ISIS in Sinjar to protect the Yazidis, and near Erbil, because ISIS was, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 miles outside of our capital. But the airstrikes made all the difference. Now we knew the United States was on our side. Now we knew that if we fought back, or when we fought back, there would be someone standing by with us. And then, of course, over time, a coalition built up. So here we are going through these very difficult challenges, 2014, 15, 16. Now you would think that with Baghdad and Kurdistan, or Erbil, both of us facing ISIS, facing this existential threat, that this would somehow unify us. Unfortunately, it did not. The government in Baghdad still refused to pay us our share of the federal budget. So throughout that time, when our Peshmerga were being killed fighting ISIS, they were not getting their salaries from Baghdad. In fact, they never have. We didn't get a penny of money from Baghdad. Baghdad didn't assist us with any of the refugees and displaced people who had fled to Kurdistan. Kurdistan region's population is 5 million. So when we're hosting nearly 2 million IDPs and refugees without any assistance from the federal government, you can imagine the resentment that that built among our people towards the federal government in Baghdad. And all of this time that the Peshmerga were fighting, I mentioned earlier that they didn't have the equipment to fight ISIS. So the United States and the coalition partners started to provide weaponry. Baghdad objected to this, and for some time they were delaying the delivery of humanitarian assistance and weapons. Everything had to land in Baghdad first, be inspected, sit on the tarmac at the airport for 3 days before it could take off again and go to Erbil. Meanwhile, our Peshmerga are being killed because they've run out of ammunition or they don't have the right weapons. So this was absolutely infuriating. And over this time, as I said, the resentment among our people towards Baghdad was getting deeper and deeper by the day. And I dare say Baghdad was also very mistrustful of us. And so the relationship was deteriorating more and more. So if we go to the next slide, by 2017, we decided to hold a referendum on independence. I didn't really go into the aspirations for independence when I spoke about our history and geography earlier. But in the early 20th century, after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was broken up, Kurdistan ended up being divided between 4 countries. And many promises were made that the Kurds in Iraq would have autonomy followed by a referendum, the same for the Kurds in Turkey. Of course, none of that came true. Turkey and Iraq ended up being dictatorships that denied the Kurds their rights, even their most basic human rights, let alone cultural and political rights. So we have always felt that there had been a historic injustice against our people at the beginning of the 20th century. And having lived through a dictatorship under Saddam Hussein and so on, and then I very briefly, and I realize I'm summing up very briefly, the tensions between Erbil and Baghdad, it should come as absolutely no surprise to anybody that in 2017, we held a referendum on independence. So this referendum was designed not to end up or result in an immediate unilateral declaration of a sovereign state. That was not our intent. Our intent was to let the people of Kurdistan, for the first time in our history, voice their aspirations. Do you want independence or do you want to stay part of Iraq? Just as the people of Quebec, the people of Scotland have had their independence referendums. Unfortunately, the United States, who we consider to be partners, friends, allies, was very much against even the holding of the referendum, which is a kind of a surprise when the United States upholds democratic rights, freedom of expression, and upholds the UN Charter, and the UN Charter talks about self-determination. We weren't surprised that the United States didn't welcome the idea of a referendum, but we were surprised by the way this was done. The US and this encouraged other countries as well, made very loud, very negative statements about even holding the referendum. Delay it, do it in 2 years' time. But why do it in 2 years' time? Is the US going to recognize it if we do it in 2 years' time? No. Okay, so why should we do it in 2 years' time if you're not guaranteeing that you would respect the result or support the result? So there were some very serious disagreements between us and our friends in Washington over the holding of the referendum and then the fallout of the referendum afterwards. Again, I'm in a hurry because I don't want to speak for too long. I want to hear your questions. I can talk a lot more about the referendum and its aftermath afterwards. But in summary, what happened was we held the referendum. 93% of those who voted said yes to independence. The turnout was over 70%, I think 74%. I may be slightly wrong there, but it was over 70%. So an overwhelming yes from the people of Kurdistan for independence. What happened was that Baghdad attacked us, helped by Iranian military leaders, including Qasem Soleimani, helped by militias. So they attacked us militarily. Baghdad isolated us by not allowing any international flights into Kurdistan region. So they put an economic embargo on the Kurdistan region. They tried to besiege us militarily. We fought back, and they tried to isolate us diplomatically. And I have to say, France played a critical role in breaking that diplomatic isolation. So the referendum, I often describe it as a euphoric and traumatic experience for us. And it was a very tense moment in our relationship with the United States, but I'm very happy to say that our relationship is strong enough and has been, let's say, has enough historic foundations to have been able to overcome those differences. And so today we're in a much better place. Now I want to jump to just the last few slides where we are today. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, I have a different slide here. Oh yes, okay, I apologize. So I just want to talk about 2020 and where we are right now. So of course, COVID-19, it's affecting all of us. I hope everybody who's watching this, that your friends and family and colleagues are all safe and doing well. I live here in the United States, so I know how much death and devastation it's causing. It's the same in Kurdistan and Iraq. Every day, the number of infections goes up. It's had a huge impact on our economy, both in Kurdistan and Iraq, wider Iraq. As I said earlier, we rely on oil. Oil prices have gone down. There are some very grim statistics about the potential poverty rate in Iraq and so on. So 2020 has not been an easy year for us in Kurdistan, just as it hasn't been for you here in the United States. So moving on to the next slide. I'm going to skip this one because we spoke about the humanitarian side. So where we are now in terms of our regional government. So the current cabinet came into office in July 2019. So just over a year and a few months. And this picture shows our Prime Minister, and seated next to him is the Deputy Prime Minister. We have a coalition government, so these are the two main parties, but there is a third party as well in the coalition. And the lady behind the Prime Minister was the Speaker of our Parliament. She was replaced, she's now a minister, but she was replaced by another woman who is currently the Speaker of Parliament. So our government is very much focused on stamping out corruption, streamlining the bureaucracy, digitizing government services. So just as in the US, you can renew your driving license online, we're trying to do those kinds of things in Kurdistan. And our Prime Minister is very much focused on delivering health, education, and e-government to our people. Now, after the tensions of the referendum and the post-referendum fallout, we have really decided to embark on a new relationship with Baghdad. So our Prime Minister, immediately after he was sworn in, he went to Baghdad, he met with the Prime Minister, with the Speaker of Parliament, with all of the political leaders in Baghdad, and said that, you know, we're all in Iraq, we all need to live together, and we want to open a new chapter. So we are doing our best to have this new cooperation with Baghdad, and especially with the current Prime Minister, Mustafa Kadhimi, there is a very good personal relationship and a very good political relationship. So moving on, this is almost the last slide, I promise. So I just want to come back to our relationship with the United States. So whoever you voted for, hopefully one of the two gentlemen is there on the screen for you. And this is really to show that we're very blessed in Iraqi Kurdistan, that we have enjoyed bipartisan support here in the United States. Before the days of COVID-19, when Congress was open, Capitol Hill was open, I would spend so much of my time on the Hill, meeting members of Congress, talking to members of the key committees that we deal with, foreign relations, armed services committees, intelligence committee, and so on. And we're very, very blessed that we have very strong bipartisan relationship and support. And there is actually a Kurdish American congressional caucus. So the United States has a very good security partnership with us. We continue to work together also with the Iraqi security forces on the need to defeat and counter ISIS. The United States, Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands are helping us with a reform program we have for our military, the Peshmerga forces. The US is the largest donor of humanitarian assistance in Iraq. And so, of course, we're very grateful for that, especially when we are hosting still 1 million refugees and displaced people. even with all of that international help, and most of it comes from the US, 75% of the cost is borne by us. But still, we're extremely grateful to the United States and to USAID for that. And then we are really trying to widen our relationship with the United States. We want to have universities link up together much more, cultural exchanges. We want to revive tourism in the Kurdistan region and so on. And also we're very focused on broadening our economic ties so that it's not just the oil companies, and of course they're very, very welcome in Kurdistan, but we want to have technology, agricultural economies, companies, and companies in the hospitality sector, for example. So I would say that our relationship with the United States today is very strong. We are very solid partners in the Middle East, inside Iraq, and we hope that that will continue. So this is really the end of my presentation, but if Cynthia wouldn't mind just showing you the next few slides, which are just pictures. So I really just wanted to show you some pictures of Kurdistan so that you have an idea of how we look. These are cultural festivals. This is a picture of the main square in Erbil, our capital, and this is where people gather to have a cup of chai or tea and chat to their friends. And then this is Soleimani, which is always considered the cultural capital of Kurdistan region. It's the city of poets, of writers, and radical thinkers. And this is actually the Millennium Hotel in Soleimani, but it's a very beautiful city. And this picture, I believe, was taken in Halabja a couple of years ago. And I believe right now we're in the pomegranate season. And pomegranates, Halabja's pomegranates are known throughout the Middle East as being the best. So we're very proud of that. And then I believe there's one more. So this is the city of Amedi, which is sits at the top of a mountain. And that's it. So that's my presentation. I hope it was interesting for you. And I really would like to thank Cynthia once again and thank all of you for inviting me to speak to you. And I'm very happy to take your questions.
Okay, we have a question from Steve Spellman, and I apologize for leaning over and looking at it. I had the good fortune to serve 2 tours with Army Special Forces fighting alongside the Peshmerga. So I can confirm what great warriors they are. My question is about President-elect Biden. As I was preparing for my second tour in Iraq, Mr. Biden proposed dividing Iraq into 3 federal parts, 1 Sunni, 1 Shiite, and 1 Kurd. To what extent has that been achieved, and what more would the Kurdish Regional Government like to achieve?
Well, thank you very much. First, thank you for your service. Thank you for what you did in Iraq. We are always very grateful to our friends, and we're not shy of saying thank you, even though many of our neighbors or certain neighbors don't like it. So a personal thank you for that. But your question about then Senator Biden's federalization of Iraq, you know, I mean, Iraq is supposed to be a federal state. It's not really completely a federal state because we only have 1 region, which is the Kurdistan region. What we would like to see from a Kurdish point of view, ideally would be 5 regions in Iraq. So you would have 1 Kurdish region, 1 region for the Sunni Arab community, 2 regions in southern Iraq, and then Baghdad, which is pretty vast, would be a region by itself and would be kind of representing all of us. You know, this would then mean that Iraq is truly federal. There is a devolution of power. But at the moment, you just have the federal government and 1 regional government, and everywhere else is divided up into provinces. It's possible that the Sunni community might want to have a region for themselves. In the early days after the 2005 constitution was ratified, the Sunnis were very much against a region because they thought they would come back to power. But I think now they've realized that the Shia are in the majority and will really be the ones, even in a coalition government, who would dominate it. So the Sunnis increasingly are looking at having a region. Every now and then in southern Iraq as well, you hear calls for a region there. It's complicated. Would Baghdad really allow this and approve this? I don't know. But in my opinion, for Iraq to thrive, we need to be a federal state to be able to then stay together. Oh, I can't hear you, sorry.
That's because I'm muted. So from Ken first, please tell us about the current relationship between the KRG and the PKK, and thank you for your excellent history summary.
Thank you. So our relations with the PKK are, I would say, perhaps complicated and tense. I assume everybody knows a little bit about the PKK. The PKK really grew out of the situation in Turkey. As I mentioned earlier, at one time you couldn't even say that you were Kurdish, you couldn't speak Kurdish in Turkey. And those kinds of policies really push people towards very radical action. And this is the situation that led to the creation of the PKK. Over the years, the PKK has managed to get a foothold in the very remote mountainous areas of Kurdistan region and based itself there. And for many years, Turkey has tried to bombard those areas, has tried to dislodge the PKK from that area, but wasn't able to. More recently, it seems that Turkey's drone technology or whatever, their surveillance technology has become more sophisticated, and they're able to pursue the PKK out of those remote areas. And unfortunately, the PKK is increasingly coming into populated areas of Iraqi Kurdistan, and Turkey still pursues them. As a result, our hapless, innocent civilians are sometimes killed and injured as a result of this. It's really a conflict between Ankara and the PKK, and we don't want any part of it, but we are caught in the middle of this. And more recently, the PKK have started to attack some Peshmerga positions and the oil pipeline that goes through Turkey to export our oil to the international market. So it's unfortunate. We have very tense situation right now. We don't want that to continue. We want all of the tensions to de-escalate. And we would like the PKK to leave Iraqi Kurdistan and take their fight elsewhere. Of course, we believe 100% in the rights of the Kurds in Turkey. I myself have many relatives in Turkey. We are related by blood, by history, by custom, and they have every right to strive for their political, cultural rights, but don't bring your fight into our territory and as a result kill our Peshmerga and civilians.
Okay, we have two questions from Ellen Kaplan, who says, first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation and for all your kindness to me, meaning Ellen. I have two questions. Could you talk about the current situation with IDPs and refugees? Are resettlement efforts underway? Are there sufficient resources? Are they being integrated into society or returning to Mount Sinjar? I apologize if I've mispronounced that. And the second question is about the AANES. What is the relationship between the KRG and the Rojava region? Are the borders open? Is there cooperation?
Well, thank you very much for those questions. So the situation, the humanitarian situation is still very difficult for us in Kurdistan, and of course goes without saying for the refugees and the displaced communities. As I said earlier, we have a population of about 5 million in the Kurdistan region. At the peak of the humanitarian crisis, there were close to 2 million refugees and IDPs. And as I said earlier, we got no help from Baghdad. Today, the number is 1 million. That's Syrian refugees and fellow Iraqis who are displaced. Among those fellow Iraqis are the Yazidis and Christians, as well as many Arabs as well. They are in Kurdistan region where they feel safe. We have close to 40 camps for the displaced and the refugees, but actually the majority of the displaced community has been absorbed by the host community. So even though we have many, many camps for the refugees and IDPs, the majority don't live in camps. COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the displaced community and on the delivery of aid. Of course, aid organizations are very concerned about their own staff and delivering aid into camps and so on. So that's had an impact. COVID-19, the pandemic itself and the spread of the pandemic is tough on everybody, but especially if you're in a camp and it's just hard to have any social distancing, frankly. So it's been very, very difficult, very challenging. And this is why we're so grateful to the United States, the UK, and other partners who help us with the IDPs. With regards to Sinjar, so Sinjar is the homeland of the Yazidis. And as I said earlier, it's actually also where my family originates from. So it's always very dear to my heart as well. Some Yazidis have started to go back to Sinjar, partly because the situation in the camps is so bad that really they might as well go back, even though it's very hard to deliver services and aid to them in Sinjar. The Kurdistan Regional Government has just recently signed an agreement with Baghdad called the Sinjar Agreement. Now, this agreement stipulates that all of the armed militias will be moved out of Sinjar, and the security will be handled by a local force. So a local force will be created, made up of local people, which is what they have always demanded, and that the situation in Sinjar should be normalized. The Sinjar Agreement is very, very important. If it's successful, it could be rolled out in other parts of Iraq where you have militias in control and people aren't able to return home. You also asked about our relationship with the Syrian Kurds, our brethren in Syria. So we have a good relationship, certainly at the leadership level. They talk to each other all the time. I talk to my counterpart from the Syrian Democratic Council here in Washington, Sina Mohammed. She's a very admirable lady, and I have a great deal of respect for her. The borders have never really been closed to humanitarian assistance or to people crossing, but there has to be control. I mean, Syria is not a normal country. ISIS is still around both in Iraq and Syria. So there are controls at the border. And I know sometimes people are very unhappy about that, but I'm sorry, security is our number one priority. But overall, we have good relations with our brethren in Syria.
This is a question from a postdoc fellow in Global Kurdish Studies at American University. What policies and projects that KRG has undertaken so far to empower women and youth in education and politics? And thank you for this excellent presentation.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. So empowering women and youth has been a policy of the Kurdistan Regional Government, I would say really for the past 15 years, and that's how long I've been working for the Kurdistan Regional Government, first in London and now in Washington. Kurdistan still has many issues to deal with regards to women and girls. There are still, unfortunately, forced marriages, FGM, honor-based violence. However, we discuss these issues openly, which in some of our neighboring countries is just unheard of. Our leaders, who are men, who are very widely respected and admired, will talk about how it's wrong to call honor-based violence honor. There is no honor in killing or violating anybody. And these are really groundbreaking statements that they make. You know, the Middle East is a conservative part of the world. So to have our leaders talk about these things really empowers women and makes those taboo subjects something that can be discussed and dealt with. And I should say that also there are so many NGOs and human rights activists and women's rights activists and so on who've played a very, very positive role. Many of them are Kurdish, others are international that have come to Kurdistan. They've played a great role in really pushing for better and greater rights for women and girls and for youth. In terms of looking ahead, the Kurdistan Parliament has a quota for women. So 30% of our members of parliament have to be women. I mentioned earlier the Speaker of Parliament is a woman. One of her deputies is also a woman. We have 3 women in our cabinet. We have 14 representatives abroad, and 2 of us are women. It should be much more, I know, and we are pushing for that. But these are all examples of how women are encouraged to be taking part in every part of society. I think I've answered that question, but if I haven't, I'm happy to carry on. I don't want to talk for too long.
In the Iraqi constitution, oil and gas belong to all Iraqis, and from that, Kurdistan is 19% of the Iraqi budget. The federal government and the Kurdistan government agreed to export 250,000 BPE and the revenue back to federal government plus borders revenue. Why does Kurdistan refuse to give this revenue to the federal government?
Okay, so I'll just explain that question a little bit for anybody who doesn't know the granular detail of our relations, the relationship between Erbil and Baghdad. So Kurdistan region exports its oil separately from the rest of Iraq's oil exports. We have a pipeline that goes from Kurdistan region north through Turkey to the Mediterranean, where our oil is sold and we keep the revenues. Now, that wasn't the intention. When we began to export oil back in 2014, our intention was that we would keep some of the revenues and give Baghdad some of the revenues. But before we could implement that, Baghdad cut off our share of the federal budget entirely in 2014. So the only way we could survive was to export the oil and keep all of the revenues, right? We had no other income. We were fighting ISIS, we had 2 million refugees and IDPs, and oil was the way we were able to survive. Now, the Iraqi budget law says that Kurdistan region should should hand over 250,000 barrels of oil a day to the federal government, and the federal government's share of the customs and so on from the border. And then the Iraqi government or the federal government would give Kurdistan region its share of the budget. Now, we actually don't have a problem with that if we were confident that we would get our share of the federal budget. We have some very bitter experiences where there have been agreements between Erbil and Baghdad, and then they haven't been honored. Also, we have oil contracts with international companies, and some of them are American. Now, these companies came to Kurdistan with their know-how and invested their money in Kurdistan, produced oil, and are exporting it. So according to our production sharing contracts, those oil companies have a right to some of the profit, right? Baghdad has a different vision of oil contracts. I think ours is much more free market. There's this much more the traditional socialist, nationalist, oil belongs to the people and we don't need anybody else. So there are many differences here. Some of them are political. Some of them are really about how you view the private sector and the involvement of international companies. So since we have these international oil companies helping us produce and export our oil, we have obligations to them. Is Baghdad ready to meet those obligations if we hand over the oil to Baghdad? So far, Baghdad hasn't been willing to do that. So Baghdad wants to take the money from the oil without taking the obligations that go with it, the obligations that we have to the oil companies. So this is actually, I'm really simplifying and summarizing this, but this is a very complicated issue. It's become complicated. Frankly, it's not complicated, but it's become complicated because of political differences. As I said, we wouldn't actually have a problem with giving Baghdad our oil for Baghdad to export it if we were confident that we would get a fair share of the federal budget. And we have no problem sharing the customs revenues according to the constitution. The Iraqi constitution says that the customs are a shared responsibility between the regional government and the federal government. So that's where we are on those issues. And again, I think I mentioned earlier, we have really tried to open a new chapter with Baghdad, and we are trying very hard to reach some amicable solutions, even though some events in the last day or two haven't been very helpful on that front.
Are there any more questions? Looks like there are not, so I'm going to thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And thank you all for joining us.
Well, thank you again, Cynthia, for inviting me. Thank you all. I hope to see you in person next time, either in Washington or over there in Massachusetts. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.